Most people think the way to deal with garden pests is to buy a spray, read the label, and hope for the best. And if that sounds familiar, you're not alone. It's what the gardening industry has trained us to do for the last 70 years. But here's the thing. Before there were pesticides, before there were garden centers, before there was a product for every problem, farmers kept pests away just fine. Not with chemicals, with plants. Traditional growers across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas figured something out that modern gardening kind of forgot. Certain plants produce compounds so powerful, so specifically designed by evolution to repel, confuse, and trap insects that no synthetic spray can fully replicate what they do. And the best part is, these plants don't just protect your garden. Most of them are edible, medicinal, or so beautiful your neighbors will ask what they are. Today, I'm giving you 7 plants that stop garden pests. Not eventually, not partially, but with a level of effectiveness that will genuinely change how you set up your garden. 7 plants rooted in centuries of proven traditional use. Stick around because number 5 on this list is one that stunned researchers when they ran trials on it. This plant doesn't just repel pests, it actually interrupts their ability to reproduce. And farmers in Southeast Asia have been intercropping with it for over 300 years for exactly that reason. And it grows in almost any climate. Number 6 is going to surprise you even more. Most people pull this one out of their garden thinking it's a weed, and you will not believe what they're throwing away. It's been shown in peer-reviewed studies to reduce aphid populations by up to 80% when grown near vulnerable crops. We dig into the real science and forgotten wisdom behind growing food and building a garden that actually works. These 7 plants are ranked from effective to absolutely extraordinary. The ones at the end of this list are the ones that will change how you think about companion planting forever. Marigolds, tagged species. Marigolds have been grown alongside food crops for so long that it's almost impossible to trace where the tradition started. What we do know is that gardeners in Mexico, India, and across the Mediterranean have been planting them at the edges of vegetable beds for centuries. And it wasn't just because they're bright and beautiful, though they are. Here's what gets overlooked. Most people plant marigolds thinking they'll just deter pests in a vague, general way. But the mechanism is far more specific than that. Marigolds produce a compound called alpha-terphenol in their roots, and when this compound enters the soil, it's toxic to soil-dwelling nematodes, the kind that attack tomato roots, pepper roots, and cucumber roots. Above ground, the flower's sulfur-containing volatile oils confuse and repel whiteflies, aphids, and thrips. Research from the University of Exeter found that French marigolds specifically reduced whitefly numbers on nearby tomatoes by up to 67% over a full growing season. That's not vague deterrence, that's measurable protection. And here's the truth. There's something quietly powerful about a plant that works on 2 levels at once, underground and above ground, protecting your crop from both directions simultaneously. The farmers who packed marigolds around their tomatoes weren't doing it for decoration. They knew exactly what they were doing, practical use. Plant French marigolds, specifically Tagetes patula, in dense rows at the border of any bed containing tomatoes, peppers, or cucumbers. Space them about 8 inches apart. For nematode control, just plant them a full season before your vulnerable crops and let the root compounds build up in the soil. Basil, Ochiamum basilicum. You might already grow basil for the kitchen, but ask yourself this. Where exactly are you growing it? Because if it's not sitting right next to your tomatoes, you're leaving one of the most effective pest partnerships in the garden completely untapped. What most growers don't realize is that basil's pest-repelling power isn't passive. It's active and chemical. Basil produces a volatile compound called estragol, also called methyl chavicol, along with linalool and eugenol. These compounds are released continuously from the plant's leaves, especially when temperatures rise during the day. And here's what's fascinating. Thrips, aphids, and tomato hornworm moths are acutely sensitive to these compounds, and they use smell to locate host plants. And basil essentially scrambles that signal. University of Florida trials showed that tomatoes grown with basil intercropped at a 1-to-1 ratio experienced significantly fewer thrips infestations than tomatoes grown alone. And basil also attracts predatory insects, particularly hoverflies, whose larvae eat aphids by the hundreds. There's something almost elegant about a plant that earns its place twice, once in your kitchen and once in the biology of your garden's pest management. It's not decoration, it's infrastructure. Practical use. Plant 1 basil plant for every 2 tomato plants, close enough that the leaves occasionally brush. Pinch basil flowers to keep the plant producing volatile oils at peak intensity. Use the harvested basil in the kitchen. This is pest control you can eat. Lavender, Lavandula angustifolia. Lavender has been cultivated for over 2,500 years. The Romans carried it into every territory they occupied, not just for the scent, but because they understood it kept things away. Fleas, moths, mosquitoes. They weren't working from a textbook. They were working from observation generation after generation. And here's the part nobody talks about. Lavender doesn't just repel, it also attracts. And that dual action is what makes it genuinely strategic in the garden. The linalool and linalool acetate in lavender are powerful deterrents for fleas, moths, whiteflies, and mosquitoes. But lavender flowers simultaneously attract bees, lacewings, and parasitic wasps, the insects that actively hunt aphids, caterpillar eggs, and scale insects. So, you're not just keeping the bad ones out, you're inviting in a natural army to handle what slips through. Studies on lavender companion planting in commercial herb gardens have shown reduced aphid pressure on neighboring crops simply because of the increased predatory insect traffic. One plant doing 2 jobs. And there's something deeply satisfying about a garden that self-regulates. That's what lavender helps you build. Not a garden you're constantly fighting, but one that has its own defense system. Practical use. Plant lavender at the corners and borders of raised beds or along pathways. It thrives in well-drained, slightly alkaline soil and full sun. Don't overwater it. Stressed lavender actually releases more volatile compounds. Use dried lavender bundles inside your seed storage area to keep moths and weevils away from stored seeds. Nasturtiums, Tropaeolum majus. Nasturtiums are one of the most misunderstood plants in the garden. Most gardeners either ignore them or treat them as a decorative afterthought. Cheerful flowers that happen to be edible. But experienced companion planters use nasturtiums as a deliberate trap crop. And once you understand why, you'll never plant a brassica bed without them again. Here's what gets overlooked. Nasturtiums are aphid magnets, and that's exactly the point. Aphids, particularly the cabbage aphid and the black bean aphid, are powerfully attracted to nasturtiums. More attracted to them, in fact, than to most vegetable crops. When you plant nasturtiums at the perimeter of a brassica bed around your kale, your cabbage, your broccoli, the aphids flock to the nasturtiums instead of your food crops. And once they're concentrated on the nasturtiums, you can either remove those plants manually, spray them with a targeted soap solution, or simply let predatory insects find them. The nasturtiums take the hit, so your crops don't have to. This is called a sacrificial trap crop strategy, and it's been used formally in organic agriculture for decades. The farmers who figured this out didn't have a degree in entomology. They just paid attention to where the aphids went. And the answer was always toward the nasturtiums. Practical use. Plant nasturtiums in dense clusters at the edges of your brassica beds, about 3 plants per 4 feet of bed edge. Monitor them weekly. When aphid populations get heavy on the nasturtiums, cut those stems off and compost them away from the garden. Nasturtiums will regrow. Your cabbages will thank you. Lemongrass, Cymbopogon citratus. Lemongrass is a staple food crop in Southeast Asia, and farmers in Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia have been intercropping it with vegetables and fruit trees for centuries. But Western gardeners mostly think of it as a culinary plant, something you buy dried at the grocery store. That's a significant underestimation. What most growers don't realize is that lemongrass is one of the most scientifically validated pest-repelling plants in existence, and its mechanism is genuinely surprising. Lemongrass produces citral, a compound that constitutes roughly 65% of its essential oil, along with geraniol and myrcene. These compounds are so disruptive to insect sensory systems that they're used as active ingredients in commercial mosquito repellents. But in the garden, the citral has been shown to repel whiteflies, spider mites, and aphids, while simultaneously disrupting the reproductive cycle of several common garden pest species. A 2016 study published in the journal Industrial Crops and Products confirmed that lemongrass essential oil caused mortality in 90% of spider mites exposed to it in laboratory conditions. And when grown as a living plant, it releases these compounds continuously. That's 300 years of farmer knowledge confirmed by a peer-reviewed study. There's something powerful about a plant that earns a place in your kitchen and in your garden's defense at the same time. Lemongrass is that plant. Practical use. Plant lemongrass in clumps at garden borders, particularly near beds that struggle with whiteflies or spider mites. In cooler climates, I grow it in containers and move it indoors in winter. Crush a few leaves periodically to increase volatile oil release near vulnerable plants, and harvest the stalks regularly. They'll regrow and stay vigorous. Stinging nettle, Urtica dioica. Here's a confession. Most gardeners, when they find stinging nettle growing at the edge of their property, immediately try to get rid of it. Thick gloves, long sleeves, a lot of frustration. And that's completely understandable. But it is also one of the most significant mistakes you can make in a biodiverse garden. And here's the part that surprises almost everyone. Stinging nettle is one of the most powerful aphid control tools in the entire plant kingdom. And not in the way you'd expect. Nettle doesn't repel aphids. It does something smarter. It acts as a banker plant, a reservoir for beneficial insects, particularly aphid predators like ladybirds, hoverflies, and parasitic wasps. These beneficial insects colonize nettles early in the season, build their populations on the small nettle aphid colonies there, and then, as your garden crops mature and become more vulnerable, they disperse outward into the rest of your garden, already hungry and already in high numbers. A 2019 study found that gardens with established nettle patches within 10 meters of vegetable beds had aphid predator populations up to 80% higher than gardens without nettles. That's not a marginal improvement. That's a transformed ecosystem. The farmers and cottage gardeners who let nettles grow at the fence line weren't being lazy. They were being strategic. They knew something we're only now quantifying. In practical use, allow a small contained patch of stinging nettle to grow at the perimeter of your garden, ideally in a spot that gets partial shade and stays moist. Use a physical barrier, like a buried edging strip, to keep it from spreading too aggressively. Harvest the young tops in spring for a nutrient-dense tea or soup, and leave the rest to do its ecological work. rosemary Rosmarinus officinalis. We're ending on this one for a reason. Rosemary is probably already in your kitchen. You might even have a pot of it on the windowsill, but there's a very good chance you don't fully know what it's doing or what it could be doing in your garden. Here's what gets overlooked. Rosemary's pest-repelling compounds are some of the most broadly effective in the plant world, targeting not one or two pest species, but a remarkable range of insects simultaneously. Rosemary produces 1,8-cineol, camphor, and alpha-pinene volatile terpenes that are profoundly disruptive to the nervous systems of soft-bodied insects and flying pests alike. Research published in Pest Management Science demonstrated that rosemary oil-based sprays reduced populations of spider mites by 52%, aphids by 43%, and thrips by 38% in controlled trials. But as a living plant, rosemary releases these compounds continuously and passively all season long in every direction. Cabbage moths, bean beetles, carrot flies, and whiteflies are all documented to avoid rosemary-adjacent planting zones. And because rosemary is perennial in most climates, it gets more established and more effective every single year. This is a plant that compounds in value the longer it stays in your garden. And here's the truth that ties all of this together. The most effective gardens aren't the most sprayed gardens. They're the most thoughtfully planted ones. Rosemary, sitting there year after year, asking for almost nothing, giving back more than most gardeners ever realize. Practical use. Plant rosemary in permanent spots near brassica beds, bean rows, and carrot patches. In cold climates, plant it in large containers that can come inside in winter. Prune it back by about a third each spring to keep it dense and actively growing. And if you want to concentrate its repelling power, crush a few branches and lay them around the base of vulnerable plants during peak pest season. We just spent time going through 7 plants that people have been growing, saving, sharing, and planting deliberately for hundreds, in some cases, thousands of years. What ties all of them together is this. Nature already solved the pest problem. Long before we invented a product to address it, the solution was growing in someone's garden, passed along through a grandmother's knowledge, a farmer's habit, a village's collective memory. The science didn't discover these plants. It confirmed what growers already knew. And that's the bigger truth here. The most powerful tools in your garden aren't the ones you buy. They're the ones you plant. The growers who built gardens this way weren't doing it by accident. They were paying attention. And now you are too. If this story changed how you look at the plants in your garden, please subscribe and like the channel. We are digging into the history and wisdom that they have tried to bury. Let's grow the future together. The next treasure trove of knowledge will open soon.